Hello everybody. My name is Mia Delve. I'm the curator and program manager at A Space Arts, and we're a visual arts organisation based in Southampton. We've been running for nearly 25 years now, and we run a kind of number of different projects. So we have artist studios, we run a graduate scheme which is called RIPE, and we also look after a beautiful building called God's House Tower. So God's House Tower is a sort of medieval monument, and we run a programme of contemporary exhibitions that sort of respond to the site, the history, or perhaps an object in the case of the exhibition we're talking about today. But yeah, we're very kind of conscious of the building and all of the histories that it contains. And so our programme attempts to kind of unpick some of those histories and sort of platform marginalised voices that don't often appear in the history books. So today we're going to talk to you about an exhibition that responds to Jane Austen's travelling writing desk, which is currently on display at God's House Tower. And the artist Jocelyn McGregor is here with us tonight to talk a bit about her commission that responds to Austen and her desk, and Northanger Abbey in particular. Before we get stuck in, I just wanted to let everybody know that the event is being recorded and is going to be uploaded to our YouTube channel so that people can continue to access it. But if you'd rather not be recorded, just switch off your camera. Just as a heads up. Cool. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panel. So first off, Jocelyn McGregor. And Jocelyn is a multidisciplinary artist based in the northwest of England. She holds a BFA in Fine Art from the Ruskin School of Fine Arts and an MFA in Sculpture from Slade. Awards include Henry Moore Foundation grants, Sculpture in the City, Aldgate Square Commission, the British Council, SWAP UK Ukraine Residency, and Bloomberg New Contemporaries. Exhibitions include DREDGED, which is a solo exhibition in partnership with Lakeland Arts and Arts&Heritage at the Windermere Jetty Museum in Cumbria. Lapsus Calami, hope I'm saying that right, Justin, which was curated by Peake at Marlborough Gallery in London. Mantle at Castlefield Gallery in Manchester. Trespassers will be detected at Dnipro Centre for Contemporary Culture in Ukraine, and a field guide to getting lost at T.A.F in Athens. Jocelyn will be moderating this conversation as well as contributing this evening, so I'll hand over to her in a moment. Our second guest speaker is Anna Bogutskaya. And Anna Bogutskaya is a writer, film programmer, and podcaster. She writes for BBC Culture, The Guardian, Mubi, The New Statesman, Time Out, and amongst others, and has programmed for BFI, Edinburgh, and Fantastic Fest. And she is currently the head of screen at South by Southwest in London, and she hosts the Final Girls podcast, created and contributes to many others as well. She publishes the movie newsletter Admit One and has written 2 non-fiction books, Unlikable Female Characters and Feeding the Monster. And Anna has also written an essay for us that sits alongside Jocelyn's commission, which is called Let Them Read Gothic Novels. And I'm going to just post that in the chat so that everybody has access to that, and possibly it's something you could kind of read after the conversation, but we will be talking a little bit about it tonight as well. That's there in the chat for people to access. And then last but not least, Matilda Moores. Matilda is an artist and academic working in sculpture, print, installation and text. Her practice and research focus on the tension between cuteness and violence. Previous shows include Witch Marks for Transition Gallery at Sluice in Colchester, The Horror Show at Somerset House, Serpent and Shadow at the Royal Academy, Auto Aim at Tokyo Gadai, and the Amber Room at Matt's Gallery. And she was recently selected for Praxis Oslo Residency and has received the Curator Space Bursary, the Gilbert Bayes Scholarship Award, and the Mara Loof Print Prize. Her writing has appeared in Monstrous Flesh Journal and Garageland magazine. And Matilda's also sent me a link, which I'll post in the chat in a minute, which is to a single channel audio work about a vampire human encounter. So that's another, yeah, another bit of kind of content for you to get stuck into after the conversation. Each of the panelists have come up with a few questions, which we're going to use to sort of guide the conversation. We're also keen for this to be an open conversation and discussion. So I'd encourage you to ask questions if you have them just throughout. And if you have anything that you'd like to ask, if you type them in the chat, and then at regular intervals, I will check the chat and we can either hand over to you if you'd like to kind of unmute your mics and speak to us in person, or I can just read out the question from the chat and we will, yeah, dig into some of those thoughts and questions, which is, yeah, going to be really exciting. And we'll also have some time at the end for questions. So if you, yeah, if you are kind of thinking one up, if you're cooking one throughout the conversation, there will be a bit of time to speak about them afterwards. Um, okay, I'm going to hand over to you, Jocelyn, and I'm going to share my screen and we're going to kind of see some images of people's work.
Hi everyone, I'm Jocelyn. I'll just wait for Mia to pop the slides up and then I'll get going.
Great.
Hello. I'm a sculptor and I sort of to try and put my practice in a bit of a nutshell, although I feel like I constantly want to break out of a nutshell. But for now, um, I'm on the hunt for this kind of point of transition between internal and external, real and imagined worlds. I often use my own body parts and sort of body casting as a conduit and I explore the inside outside topography of the female form, my own form looking to like surrealism and supernatural fiction to investigate the identification of women or generally people with the earth, the home, and the machine. Um, so the materials that I use, domestic fabrics, beauty products, earth pigments, or industrial materials, these kind of represent to me this point of transition or slippage between worlds, between the body, between and the moment it meets the organic or the manufactured world, or the dreaming world, the unconscious world, or the world of horror. This closeness comes with bed sheets, towels, clothes, beauty products, and they cleanse us, support us, camouflage or modify our appearance, or take us from unconscious to dreaming. So in my sculptures, I combine all these signifiers and I blurred boundaries between those worlds, resulting in a kind of supernatural hybrid of the two. So for my exhibition at the God's House Tower, which was No Notion of Loving by Halves, um, I made this in response to Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey. It was quite an exciting, sort of going slightly off script here, but it was quite an exciting opportunity for me because it was the first show in a while had just been like, do you want to just focus on the Gothic? I'd done a lot of sort of eco-Gothic horror style shows in the run up, and this one was like I got to go full Gothic for it. Um, so it was made in response to Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, which for those who haven't read it, is probably best described as a kind of parody-esque Gothic novel. Um, and it's quite short. It's quite a short Gothic novel that was made at the height of the kind of um, Gothic literature kind of craze, as it were. So the first things that I sort of zoomed in on that really struck me in the novel and had always struck me was Austen's own fangirling of other female Gothic novelists. Most notably like Anne Radcliffe, whose novel Mysteries Udolpho gets mentioned multiple times. In fact, pretty much the plot kind of rests on that book. Um, so on the one hand, I loved that relationship she was having with like Jane Austen was having with other female Gothic authors, and I related to that in my own work. But I also love that kind of blend of fact and fiction that I think really typifies horror for me. And what I love about horror and the Gothic we use is that tension line between reality and fiction. Secondly, the intense relationships between female characters in the book was something I wanted to zoom in on, and that's where the title comes from. So there's from a quote from Isabella says to the heroine Catherine, like, I have no notion of loving by halves. Um, and the kind of complex sticky web. So, great slide, thank you, Mia, for landing on that one. Um, yeah, so this kind of complex sticky web of meaning and irony and dark humor, fact and fiction that I kept walking in on it, like into constantly in the book as well, something that I really wanted to draw out in my exhibition. Um, so Jane Austen, when I first read Northanger Abbey, I was kind of angry. I was angry at my like beloved genre being parodied. And then as I got into the book, I was like, I'm not quite sure if I should be taking this all on face value. There's certain parts of it that can only be irony, and that made me feel like something wasn't quite at play. Um, and then itself, so after the whole book unfolds, and I'm not gonna, I feel like it's a spoiler, isn't it, if I tell you the ending? But anyway, after it all unfolds, um, I then discovered that it was most probably based on the true history of the Duchess of C star star star, who was imprisoned by her own husband in a dungeon for 9 years. So I think there's this part of a novel where it's like the joke's on you or the joke's on society. And that was something that I really want to draw out in. I think a lot of horror deals with that as well. And it felt very timely at the moment, maybe to start delving into those kind of things. Um, so the actual work or the actual show is a sculptural installation, sort of with these big kind of curtains that were inspired um, by God's House Tower itself, really, and nearby Netley Abbey, which would have been possibly an inspiration, most probably an inspiration behind Northanger Abbey. And also there were these sort of body parts caught in webs on bed sheets um, throughout the exhibition. There was also, I made a live performance that was also filmed, that you can see as part of the show. This was acted by three actors who were brilliant. Um, I've got Anna Carr in green and then two in white, Anna Charbel and Mayday Hibbard. Um, the best way of sort of describing this is, well, on a personal level, it was probably my first little mini horror movie, experimental horror movie of my own. Um, and then on another level, it was kind of me essentially sort of rewriting or reimagining parts of Northanger Abbey, as if it wasn't a parody, or as if again, sort of as if all the horror was true, which is kind of secretly what I was disappointed about when I first read it, or that was the source of my outrage. So I feel like it was like part of me like working through that throughout the show, was to create this live performance. Also, it was filmed and it's performed amidst the sculpture, which like the sculpture installation, which for me is an important part because again, it blends this fact and fiction. The audience, whether you're watching it on the film or whether you're watching it live, you're also standing in the installation. It's kind of it's happening in front of you, and you're sort of dipping in and out of this imagined fiction, this story, and you're whilst in your kind of in the environment that you're in, and having to take in your kind of having to sort of literally occupy those two territories at once, which is something that I love playing with um, in my work. So I think I probably jabbered on for like long enough. I have no end to my jabbering, so I'm going to pass over.
Hi. So yeah, I guess firstly, I want to say thanks to Jocelyn for inviting me to speak. I'm very excited to talk to you and Anna about horror and the Gothic and kind of genre in artwork. And thanks also to A Space for hosting. I'm going to maybe be a bit more militant about when I have my slides changed because I planned certain things to say with certain slides. So if I could have my first slide, please, Mia. Okay, so um, casting your mind back to the beginning of this conversation at 6:10, my name's Matilda Moores. I'm an artist and an academic who makes sculpture, installation, print, text, and audio. So I'm what you might call multidisciplinary. I like to dip my toes into lots of different ponds. But running throughout my practice is this, as Mia was saying, this kind of tension between the cute and the violent. So cuteness is often used as a way to kind of obscure violence. And within my work, I'm interested in drawing connections between the physical stresses and abnormalities of cartoon and monstrous bodies, and the ideas of abjection and difficulty, which have a kind of history in feminist and queer artwork. So what do I mean by that? I mean that I think that essentially the kind of bendability, the malleability, the porousness of cartoon bodies, the kind of sutured together torso of Frankenstein or like SpongeBob SquarePants porous, porous body, for me, really tell us, or what I hope to do in my work is to explore the way that these bodies can kind of tell us something about when we have to meet systems and realities that are kind of potentially oppressive or don't quite fit us. So this image that we're looking at now is a piece called Denied Mass. It's a drawing of SpongeBob SquarePants. And I'm really obsessed at the moment, especially with redrawing cartoons. So this is my kind of bootleg version of SpongeBob SquarePants. And the piece is called Denied Mass because cartoon bodies, I think, always exist in this tension between being kind of real and 3D, but being rendered flatly. And I'll talk a little bit about flatness next. So if we could move on to the next slide. Yeah, so another kind of key thing that runs throughout my practice is this investigation of the boundary between flatness and depth. So I'm really interested in the permeability of surfaces, skin, walls, pages, and screens, and how we kind of press up against them. So this is a piece called Sans, Sinew, Sans, Sense, which was incredibly difficult to photograph, but it's, I guess, a sort of skin tent. It's made of latex, and it's a cartoon character that I designed, rendered in kind of latex, and then pinned to the floor with these concrete bones and kind of pushed back up with these back scratches in the shape of hands. So this kind of the eyes of the character are sort of being clawed at from the inside out. And yeah, so I think this, what I'm really interested in as a sculptor, which I suppose is the way that I would identify myself primarily, is how flat things can have volume. And again, this is about a kind of tension between a tension around kind of the expectation of a sculpture to take up space and making it out of a material that's flat and so inherently doesn't take up very much space. Yeah, if we can move on to the next slide, that would be great. Okay, amazing. Thank you. So, this is another piece that kind of grappled with, maybe quite literally with the way the hand is moving this piece, grappled with flatness and depth. So, this is a piece that I made for the horror show at Somerset House, which is a large scale print. It's about 5 meters by 3 meters, just for sort of scale sense. And the cartoon hand here is kind of clawing the gallery wall. So the drawing and the cartoon and the monstrous body has left fiction and entered reality, and is kind of sitting on the boundary of the gallery wall and kind of clawing away at it. So again, investigating, I think, I saw lots of connections as Jocelyn was speaking between her work and mine. because I'm also interested in this boundary between flatness and depth, in this boundary between the fictional cartoon or monstrous world and the real messy flesh world that we live in. And again, I think that cartoons and monstrous bodies offer us a way to try to understand how to be in a world that might be uncomfortable for us. All of that said, I think that my work has a general sense of fun. And so thematically, I'm trying to deal with ideas of conformity, bodies, the adolescent, the girlish, and kind of anxieties that come from a kind of adolescent and girlish state. And politically, I think my work wants to make the case for frivolousness as an act of resistance. Yeah, so if we can move to the next slide, that would be fabulous. So I don't know how clear this is going to be. This is a very new piece of work that I've just been making in January, which is comprised of this kind of infamous IKEA heart lamp, which is the feature of a lot of kids' bedrooms, certainly in the early 2000s. So the materials for this piece, the lamp, there is also a temporary tattoo, which I think you can just make out of Bugs Bunny um, as a kind of skeleton. It's from a particular cartoon called Bugs Gets the Boyd. And in this moment in the cartoon, Bugs Bunny thinks his body is buried under sand and he thinks that he's kind of died and his body has become skeletal, but actually it's all kind of illusion. But again, this cartoon character in this moment is grappling with a body that is a kind of fantasy and a sort of monstrous one. And then the other material in this work is mealyworms. So the back of this sculpture is filled with kind of maggots. And this is part, this piece being very new is part of a kind of ongoing investigation of mine that started recently into the idea of the abject cute. So trying to find a space for cuteness to resist just being cute. And to be kind of disgusting at the same time. And for me, there's a really particular politics in this. Um, Lots of research around cuteness often affiliates it with kind of marketing and selling things to people and sweetness. And I think actually there's a mistake made, and cuteness can have a kind of resistant politics, but maybe only when it becomes abject. So that's why in this new series of works that I'm making, which this is the first of, where I'm kind of combining insect bodies and childhood lamps with cartoon character decals as a way to sort of explore a combination of cuteness and disgust. And we can move on to the final slide now. Great. So yes, as well as my creative practice, which I've just been talking about, I am also an academic and a researcher, and much of my research has focused on the Gothic. So something I haven't really talked about in so far in these kind of past few minutes, but that is a real like deep love of mine, and maybe my entry point into ideas of the kind of Gothic is vampires. So I recently co-edited a duo online publication, so for Praxis Presents and Dilettante Army. And as well as co-editing those two digital publications, I contributed a piece that I authored with Sarah Klugage and Micah Statz, which was about the architecture of vampire clubs. And specifically, I was writing about the way that glamour works in the vampiric. And so within my research, I am really interested in kind of expanding, I suppose, the way that horror and kind of Gothic archetypes have a connection to the feminine. And I'll finish up there. Thank you very much.
Hi, I feel so deeply overwhelmed by both Jocelyn and Matilda's work. I was just nodding very aggressively as the both of you were speaking, because I come from an entirely different world, as you see through my slides. So it is both very thrilling and also deeply intimidating. And I loved your presentations. So a little bit about me. I'm a writer, I'm a curator, I'm a podcaster, and believe me, I spent about 30 minutes playing around with what order those should be in because I'm going to talk a slightly different language because I come not from the art world, but from the film world. I've spent my entire career in film across many of its different tentacles, and mainly, if I may borrow your terms as well, it's that multi-hyphenate, multidisciplinary element that's always been attracted to me. That's always got me into trouble as well. I've always been very intrigued by the film industry from an industrial point of view, and that's where programming and curation has really come into play. And I've been lucky enough to work both in a cinematheque environment when I was programming at the BFI in London, and also from a festival environment, which is a very different kind of curation that's much more attuned to new work, to films and filmmakers that are actively making work right now, to what's new, to what's up and coming, and how to best platform that work at whatever the festival it is that you're working with and their particular audience. And then on the writer side, I've experimented with different forms of film criticism and journalism, from very short form reviews to longer form reviews. And I think the place where I found most satisfying is in long form essays that really straddle criticism, personal essays, and more historical approaches. I think the combination of the work that I do with the new, with programming and curation, is really then complemented by my interest in my love for film history and for cultural criticism as well. And that has then found the best expression through my books and long form writing that I do both on my Substack as well as with magazine journalism. Uh, this is not the conversation to go into the dire strait of cultural media right now, but anyone who's listening in will know that there's increasingly fewer places to write long form cultural pieces in. So books it is. And with podcasting, that has always been primarily a genuine love and obsession of mine, and something that I have listened to very curiously for years and years and years before I started actually making it my own work. And increasingly, that is also an expression of both my curatorial aspirations and my writerly work, because it is the perfect combination of very in-depth, long conversations, particularly in the Final Ghost podcast, and how that's been developed, also very much guided by my interests at that time. So that might range from everything from vampires at the moment, where I was most obsessed with vampires, to currently working on the next series, which is all about the intersections of technology and horror. It is essentially a thematic guide through horror film and TV history, and it has evolved from a screening series that I co-founded with a friend of mine back in 2016. Those screenings, which took us all around the country, then evolved into a more editorial and permanent platform, which was the podcast, and increasingly so. And this has more to do with the way that I approach podcasting as a whole. I'm much less interested in the industrial element of it. I'm more interested in the creative potential of podcasting as cultural criticism, and essentially thinking of those conversations that I'm recording, editing, and amplifying with audio magic into essentially audio essays. And I've experimented a lot throughout the years that I've produced and hosted the Finer Goals with different formats, and tune them up based on the particular theme and the subject that we're exploring. So I've jumped around a lot, but I can talk a little bit more in depth about some of the key projects if we can move on to the next slide, please. So this is some of the audio work that I do. I've done a lot of podcasts, both as a host, as a producer. Some of them have been commissioned by organizations or companies, and some of them have been entirely self-initiated. I've picked out the ones that are most recent to me and that I'm most proud of, and you can also see a lot of them are coming back to horror as well as one of my key focuses. Eerie it exists, which is also one of the reasons why I was really interested in making audio work, is because with curation, the the frustration that I always had was all of the research and the investigation and the conversation and events that could happen and connect with an audience after those events and those screenings and those festivals were done, disappeared into the ether. And podcasting really offered a way for me to capture those conversations and to let them live on and be accessible to a wide global audience without any ticketing barrier. Obviously, there's other barriers to audio podcasting, but increasing the technology, it allows us to circumvent those as well with transcripts and other opportunities. But Eerie, for instance, is a podcast that I devised and produced and hosted, which is where I commissioned original horror stories specifically written for the audio medium and really richly illustrated with sound design and original musical compositions as well. Peake TV is a podcast which is much more about contemporary TV culture and deep diving into series. And The Final Girls, which is my most long-running project, is the horror film and TV history podcast that I was mentioning before, currently in its 8th season. And the very much the place where a lot of my constant investigations of horror, both historical and contemporary, that is the vessel for it. And if we move on to the next slide. The curation element, these are just a few of the examples of projects that I've curated, some of them under the banner of The Final Girls, like the Unholy Woman series that I did for the Barbican eons ago, and Cruel Flesh and In Dreams Are Monsters. In Dreams Are Monsters was something that was co-curated with 2 other curators for the BFI a few years ago, and Cruel Flesh was a series looking at the films of the New French Extremity. And these are some of the examples of the sort of films that has always interested me, and more particularly curatorially, what's always been appealing to me, which was always more difficult to produce in a cinematheque environment, is more thematic and intersected stories. So Raised by the Internet, which is the image that you see right behind Cruel Flesh and In Dreams Are Monsters, was a series of films that were interacting with and inspired by or taking from internet culture and internet aesthetics, and that I presented years ago now, about in 2018. And those kind of intersections between films, between film history, between the internet, between music, technology, and art has always been the meeting point that I've always tried to incorporate into every single season or series that I'm curating. And that obviously belongs a lot more in a cinematheque or venue environment rather than a festival. But those are some of the seasons that I was most proud of working on. And if we move on to the next one, it's just a snapshot of the books that I've published so far. Unfortunately, there will be more to come, but these are the first 2 unlikable female characters actually spun out of a season that I curated at the BFI also years ago. And like I mentioned before, that idea or that desire really for those ruminations, those essays, that investigation, that research, and really those conversations that can spring out of a curated series of public events, but disappear immediately after they're over. As much as the podcast is a vehicle for that, a book became that as well for me. Some unlikable female characters emanated from that series, and as soon as that program was done, I felt like there was more to say and more to do, and I wanted more people to be able to access that. So that was published in 2023. And then last year, Feeding the Monster came out, which is my second book of nonfiction, and one that is a lot more focused on the horror genre, and very specifically focused on writing a kind of film criticism and cultural criticism that I think is very often lacking, both in the horror space and in the cultural criticism space. Horror is often discussed as something that is very one note and very commercially focused and very devoid of artistic value. Obviously, all of us on this panel here disagree with that. And I'm aware of it. But it was very much not only just my own love letter to the genre as a whole, specifically also it was written from a very emotional point of view. In a nutshell, it was about horror films and feelings. And it was also trying to write film and cultural criticism in a way that was in tune with how films are supposed and designed to make audiences feel. So not over intellectualizing the critical approach, not overly concerned with the production history or tidbits of the making of films, but rather tapping into why they might be garnering the sort of emotional, visceral reactions from audiences as really the key to unlock why horror over the past 10, 15 years has experienced such a rapid expansion of mainstream success. That's also for another conversation as to how we define mainstream success, but it's undeniable, even in such regrettable terminology as elevated horror, that horror has really accessed places that it was never allowed to be in before, culturally, publicly, in terms of awards bodies, in terms of scale of distribution, and in terms of how recognized and big some of the recent filmmakers and stars of horror films have become, which I think is a perhaps a good way to end this part of the presentation and get talking between ourselves, which is the part that I was really looking forward to.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, great to hear from all of you. I'll hand over now. I just wanted to remind people to pop questions in the chat if you have them, and for anyone who's watching on Instagram, we're also checking that. So yeah, if you have questions on Instagram, put them there, and we can also put them to the panel as well. But I'll be quiet now.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I'm really excited for this next bit too. So with questions, we're gonna kick off with, we've got a series of questions that we've had a chat between ourselves ahead of time. So we're gonna go through and kind of ask our own, but I get to start, and it's a bit of a two-parter. But pose to you both, and I'll direct. I'll go Matilda first. What is your relationship to horror and or the Gothic, i.e. your horror origin story, and why you decided to professionalize it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you'll probably have to answer this after me and Anna do, because I'm very interested to know what you've got to say about it as well. But yeah, so I maybe have two origin stories. I mean, many origin stories, but one which is a bit more personal, which maybe I'll save for in a second because it's a bit sillier. But in terms of my work, I suppose that my relationship to horror is really through the grotesque. I think that's primarily what I'm kind of interested in my work, and what I think ties together both the monstrous body and the cartoon body. Um, with lots of origins in kind of watching Ren and Stimpy as a younger person, and being kind of always very excited by disgust and the possibilities of kind of discussed, and how you maybe sneak in some things which are like unacceptable or subcultural. And I think horror does a really good job of sneaking in some. I mean, we'll talk a little bit more, and Anna's already made the point that kind of mainstream horror now is maybe talking about things it wasn't allowed to talk about before. But traditionally, horror has been a bit of a vehicle for sneaking in ideas of kind of alternative desire, which is where what crosses over with my love of vampires. But yeah, so all of this is to say, really, it's the kind of monstrous body that I'm interested in, and really that has its origins in the Gothic, and particularly, I suppose, in like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and sort of stories that were coming out of the 19th century. And in kind of thinking and pulling ideas together in preparation for this talk, I guess I was also really struck by the fact that the kind of the Gothic and monstrous body arises at the same moment as Capital. And I think a lot of the cartoons that I'm really interested in from the kind of 90s that are grotesque arrive at the point that childhood becomes really overtaken by Capital. Um, People like Naomi Klein and No Logo talk about this in a lot more detail. So yeah, I think essentially the grotesque body, and I've always been very interested in kind of backed in. Um, and really horror only, or the kind of undertones of violence and the grotesque body only really became a part of my work in an explicit way when I was studying at the Royal Academy. Um, and this was like in the main part due to a really fantastic critical fellow that we had there called Martin Westwood, who we did a big series of reading around the ideas of shadows and snakes. And we read a book called The Parasite by Michel Serres. Apologies for French pronunciation to anyone who can actually speak French. But in the book, this book is like really interested in the idea that all relationships are parasitical in some way. And for me, it re-sparked this kind of interest in the idea of misadjusted relationships. And I think that the grotesque and cartoon bodies in my work have a misadjusted relationship to reality, and that's what I'm kind of interested in exploring. Um, and then like the sillier version of this is that when like I mean I guess I must have been like 21 and I was having, let's say, a slightly altered experience of reality one evening, and I was on my way back with my boyfriend at the time from this night that we'd been to, and I had this like very intense sort of feeling of connection with the vampire, to the point of like a feeling that maybe I was, or that there was something in me that was kind of vampiric in some way. And anyway, we got back to my flat and he fell asleep, and I stayed up all night going on real vampire forums on the internet. So there are some really like Les Vampires, there's a very good one. And there's also one which is just, I think, called vampirewebsite.net, where there's lots of people talking about their experiences of being real vampires and also real slayers, which actually I think I probably, having read the material, I'm probably more of a real slayer than a real vampire. But I basically had this kind of transcendental experience where I was like, maybe I am in part vampire. Um, but what was really fascinating to me about those forums is, again, what's fascinating to me about the Gothic, which is this complete blurring of the boundary between what's fictitious and what's real. And actually, especially when you read these forums with people talking about their lives as vampires, it's arguable whether they are or whether they aren't, and actually whether or not the figure of the vampire and other kind of monstrous figures are fictitious or not. They have real impacts on the material world. Um, and so I think like that's the sillier version, I suppose, of what really got me excited in the monstrous and the way it can kind of blur the boundary between reality and fiction.
That's so interesting. I'm like the theme of like the blurring boundaries. I'm loving it. I'm loving it. Right, what about you, Anna?
I think that's a real theme. And I was thinking of my genuine answer to try to make it sound smarter, to follow that up. But genuinely, I think the my relationship with horror has actually been, I think, a lot more is separate from Gothic. I wouldn't actually say that I have a particularly deep relationship with Gothic, and I always wonder whether that's because I didn't grow up in the UK, where there's such a long tradition of Gothic fiction. So I was exposed to it much later, and it always was presented to me as the higher end of literature, which when you grow up as a horror fan or as a secret horror fan, you're then kind of categorically against because you just want to watch Nightmare on Elm Street 5 again. But it was actually unsurprisingly, through films, and particularly through Nightmare on Elm Street, which I was exposed to at a very young age. I think I was about 8 or 9, and it was shown to me by my older cousin. And it was the first and the second film shown on the same bootleg VHS. And I didn't understand what a sequel was at that point. So in my mind, I received them as one film. And if for anyone who's seen Nightmare on Elm Street 2, you know that it has nothing to do with the first one, really, outside of Freddy Krueger. But I think, and I had nightmares for a month after that, and I imagined and hallucinated Freddy Krueger under the bed, in the TV, behind the curtains, calling to me and trying to get at me and my parents. And once he disappeared, I went back for more. I went back for part three, and that became an endless obsession and passion of mine. And I think a part of it, and thinking about it now, and especially listening to you, Matilda, I think that what was really terrifying, and it continues to be my favorite part of horror films, but and horror fiction as well, is that blurring between, is this a dream? Is this reality? Is it a door that I can close and the boogeyman, the monster, cannot enter it? The case of Nightmare on Elm Street, for anyone who's not familiar with the film, you should be. Go watch it after this talk. The titular boogeyman is a deceased serial killer, so it's a ghost who is able to access teenagers' dreams and kill them as they're sleeping. So the idea of safety is completely eradicated, which for a kid is something when neither your house, your parents' house, your bed, the bathroom, under the blanket, nowhere is safe. This particular ghost killer figure can penetrate every single safe space. And in that film, as well as all the subsequent ones, this blurring of, am I awake? Am I dreaming? Can Freddy get me? Can I get him? Is he real? Can I get them? Is a consistent theme and a really, really rich one. And one of the things that's always excited me about horror from when I was a kid into when I started going into the film industry, and then as I developed more as a critic and as a programmer, the thing that excited me always the most, that I think is its most creative potential, which is why I get so cross when people say that it's a lesser genre, creatively speaking, is that there are no rules. You can you can play around with this lack of boundaries. You can create worlds. You can create all of these opportunities to explore emotions and subjects and realities and experiences, both bodily and emotional ones, through these fictional scenarios that don't make them any less real, in the same way as on a really, really basic personal level. You experiencing the world or having a dream does not make it any less than something that we generally consider a little bit more elevated. So that's my both my entry point and my relationship with horror.
I
Yeah.
just want to say something very, very briefly. Yeah, it's interesting. I was just thinking as you were speaking then that actually it is the kind of the technology of horror works to blur the boundary between reality and fiction, because you watch something fictitious, but the fear response is a real one. And so actually the technology of all horror is necessarily a blurring of, or a kind of breakdown of the boundary between what's real and what's not. And that's also like something that we're incredibly afraid of, right? The breakdown of that boundary.
Mm.
But yeah, I would love to hear yours, Jocelyn. You weren't set to answer this question, but I would love to find out about your origin story.
Well, I kind of thought it was silly, but now actually it fits totally in with the blurring boundaries. Basically, I was being really naughty at the incredibly young age of 3, which is crazy. And I was put to bed early. I brought my copybook. And then I heard my parents go to bed. I was also quite manipulative and whatever. I heard my parents go to bed, and I was like, right, I'm going downstairs and I'm getting my time back that was taken from me. Um, so I went downstairs and I put the TV on, and this clown, kind of stop motion clown, starts crawling out of a plug hole towards the TV. So we all know what film this is. I didn't actually know what film it was till I was about 13. So it was it. But obviously, to my 3-year-old brain, I didn't really understand the difference between fact and fiction in a weird way. I'd never seen anything like that on a TV screen before. And it kind of looked a bit cartoon-esque because of the stop motion. And then this clown comes out, and I was like, oh crap, this is what happens to kids when you're being naughty, when you're like past a certain time. So I switched the TV off, ran upstairs, got into bed, and was like thinking, this clown's got out the TV. It's all my fault. What have I done? My mum gets up, like comes into my room, slams the light out. She's like, "Yo, why are you so naughty?" Just shouting out. Switches the light off, goes back to bed, and I'm just sat there, also knowing in my bed is this kind of crocheted clown my grandma had made for me. And I sat there with this crocheted clown all night, wide awake, terrified. Sort of in the morning, obviously nothing had happened, and I was like, oh, I survived. It was, and then ever since with like chasing that thrill, so I kind of yeah, I was that was it. Anything that had a sort of a horror bent or was right up my street from that kind of that age. But I think, yeah, again, it's that blurring boundaries. It's the, was it reality? Was it fiction? I remember like, finally working out that it was it. And yeah, it was like it was the best day of my life. I was like, I actually know what I watched now at that age. But yeah, that's me. And then I think professionalizing it's because it just sticks with you. It literally haunts you, doesn't it? I think horror. There you go. That's mine.
Shall I ask? I'm next up, right, to ask my question. Um, so I think both of you have touched on this slightly already, but just maybe to dig a bit deeper in some of the things that we've already spoken about. I was interested to know what kind of functions or uses of horror interest and excite you. And yeah, are the most prevalent in your practice. But I guess I'm really interested in like, yeah, the use and the function. What is there in horror that kind of really gets you going?
Who wants to go first?
You want to take it, Jocelyn, first?
Yeah, I'll go first. I'll go first. So I feel like we sort of touched on this, which is also really exciting. But the idea of I've like I've sort of semi-coined it. It's a mash-up phrase. Transcendence from below, which is also an essay, but just ignore the essay if you Google it because that's not what I'm referencing. Um, but this transcendence from below came out of an argument I had at the Miskatonic Institute of horror studies with a sci-fi fan. So sci-fi fans, they go to the horror conferences, don't they? But they don't really mean it. And I found myself sat next to one of these guys who then went on a tirade that horror it was less intelligent, and that sci-fi was so much better. It was more creative because it built whole different realities and universes, and those stories took place in those realities. So they had a different set of rules, different set of laws, different set of reasonings, and all of that was created. And the stories kind of came out of that and had to kind of occupy this different space. So he was like, basically, you transcended reality with sci-fi in an almost religious sense, and you can't do that with horror. In horror is basically transcendence, and he said transcendence to below, because it's more concerned with like death, hell, ghosts, zombies, basically stuff that should be buried, and stay buried. And he was like, basically, the whole story is just surround them invading the real world, so you never really departed from the reality or from your everyday. Um, and I was like, you're sort of right, but also obviously completely wrong because that's the best part about it. In many ways, I think that's more ballsy. You're taking on reality. You are taking on kind of all the social norms. You're hitting those face on. You're not having to kind of pull out completely. Um, so I said, and also you should be saying it's transcendence from below because it is these kind of monsters or these supernatural kind of happenings or elements that are kind of breaking into our world. They're sort of like burgeoning up. So I always feel like it's sort of anything that society others or rejects or buries, kind of tries to get rid of, as it were, or push away. Um, that that's what breaks the surface with horror, or that's what horror narrative kind of allows to kind of come up. So I always feel like it's like the seeds, and the more kind of soil you put on it, the more you try and damp it down, the more kind of it's going to grow, the more you're fertilizing it. And so it kind of will eventually make its way up through the cracks. I also think like revenge and guilt play so strongly in horror because of these things, like they're things that can't be kind of laid to rest. Ghosts that have unfinished business. I think that's why a lot of kind of feminist elements, because there's so much wrong has been done to women in the past, that you have like rape revenge narratives, and you've also got a lot of kind of female ghosts like The Ring, etc. Having had these kind of things happen. So for me, it really was it like so. Firstly, yeah. So I think horror and more broadly, like our fears, tells a lot about society and what we live in. And I think that is what is so creative, and that is what is so incredible about horror is it does occupy that line, and it makes you focus on that line. Um, and it's, what scares us, why it scares us, should it scare us, and kind of, or what are the kind of origins of that. And secondly, I think, as we've said again, it's the like having to occupy reality and fiction simultaneously, both as a reader and often through the protagonist, I think. So it's like you've often got this protagonist who's kind of not believed, or they're going into this story with one set of kind of ideas, and they're having those challenged. And then as a reader or a viewer or an audience member, you're also having going through that journey, you're also having to have that. Um, and thirdly, I put, yeah, of thirdly, I love the kind of the flexible membrane. I love the fact that these like monsters and stuff just won't stay out of our world. In like, I love that. I love that kind of leaky nature. I just think in terms of like subculture and like things that are othered. I mean, I myself, like, I guess in school and things like what ha my teeth or whatever had like what time is it, Mr. Wolf and stuff. Like I personally was always like occupying that thing between sort of being monstrous and being but also be looking kind of a bit like most final girls, or and also looking like a lot of the ghosts with the long brown hair. So there's like, again, I do think there is this sort of the flexible membranes are often even flexible between the nature of the characters themselves and the nature of the villains. And that's what I love about horror, and that's what I've always kind of riffed off, I think, in my work.
Mm. I think it was so interesting to listen to that because I was thinking about what is it and how has it changed? And obviously, my work is slightly different because the expression that it takes is a little bit more critical or um in a or curatorial in a different form. But I was thinking about how, and perhaps this is my contrarian nature, but I was thinking about this encounter with a sci-fi fan that you were describing, Jocelyn, and how that has also, not that specifically, but there's always been this constant pushback against horror that has been a really big motivator. Because I think a lot of my work has been based on trying to make people who don't appreciate horror see what I'm saying and see what so many other people see and appreciate about the genre and the myriad possibilities of it. So essentially kind of trying to convince the cynics that horror is not just one thing. I've always found it deeply frustrating that horror is a genre, both across page, screen, and everywhere else, that has this assumptions, that carries this assumption in it that it is just blood and guts and jump scares. It's the only thing. People forget about Gothic. I think it's really interesting when we talk about Gothic slash horror. I feel like Gothic has been kind of promoted up to an upper echelon, up to an upper cultural echelon. It's like, well, it's Mary Shelley. That's proper literature. They teach that in schools. Well, it's Anne Radcliffe. Well, it's the Brontes. Like that's proper culture. It's not horror. That was horror at that time. In the same way in film history, some of the the adaptations of those works, something like Rebecca by Alfred Hitchcock, some of the earlier women's films like Gaslight or Suspicion, those are horror films. Those were done with the pretense of scaring and titillating their audiences, but because they were made at this particular time and they're now part of our canon, our historical appreciation, and many critics and cinematics around the world screen them constantly, they've been promoted. So I think I've always been motivated by trying to explore and articulate all the possibilities of horror and how they're constantly shifting and evolving and have and every single filmmaker is their own island and are interested in the different possibilities of horror. And this is just cinematic horror, the stuff that's on the screen, let alone everything that is a possibility artistically or on the page. So, and one of the strong elements of the work, and it was very much the impetus for Feeding the Monster as well, my book, is that horror is a deeply emotional genre. And I don't think that it's talked about often as an emotional space. When Matilda, you were talking earlier about like the abject cute, which I think is a really powerful, really interesting aspect. And I thought about and researched the abject a lot because I always had this reaction to horror that was not just fear. It could create anxiety. It could also be really soothing. It could be deeply beautiful. It could be titillating. It could be erotic. There were so many different emotional and physical reactions you can have to horror on the screen that I felt so angry about the fact that it was being reduced to just, well, it's jump scares for a minute and then you're done. Those are long-lasting, really complicated, really deep emotions, and these creations can touch upon them and actually reach quite further down into us. And if they really grab us and grab onto something quite deep and quite personal, I think that no other genre has the potential to do that. And one thing that I find that horror always demands from its viewer is a real sense of honesty and a real sense of earnestness. Horror doesn't work if you come into it with airs. It doesn't work if you come into it with an ironic pretense. Horror is it's dead in the water if we start making memes and laughing at the monster as soon as they appear. So I think that demand from the work from the audience to be completely vulnerable in order to feel its full effect is something quite unique and something that makes us as audience members quite vulnerable, and nobody likes to be vulnerable. So I think that is also like a real raw potential of horror that very few people discuss, particularly because there's this idea, and I think horror fandom is a whole other really interesting aspect of, oh, how many films have you watched? How many directors do you know? How many Wikipedia facts can you troll off? It's more about sometimes about consumption as opposed to feeling, or more about over intellectualizing things so that you protect yourself from talking about how these films and these images have made you feel and how you've experienced them and internalized them. And I found that that is a thing that really motivates me, because I think also in terms of making it more accessible and inviting people, particularly horror cynics or horror atheists, into that space, is kind of telling them that there is a different kind of horror for everyone. And if you find the thing that ticks your box, that really makes you feel, that allows you to be vulnerable and receive this art in a way that it was intended to, that's an incredibly powerful experience. And, just from a curatorial point as opposed to an artistic point of view, I want more people to be able to have that because it has been so deeply influential and cathartic and important in my own life.
It's really interesting hearing you talk about the kind of different emotive possibilities of horror, because part of my like slightly sneaky reason for asking this question was that I was thinking about whether art can really be scary, because we come into, we've been talking a lot, I suppose, so far about kind of horror and its influence on us, and primarily talking about kind of cinema or maybe books. And I think thinking about this and how we relate this idea to art, I was very kind of taken with the idea that maybe I've seen maybe one piece of artwork that is scary by Diego Marcon, a really fabulous piece of work that was at Sadie Cole's gallery. But for the most part, art isn't necessarily scary. And so I was interested in hearing about the function of horror as a way to get into how art can, like, I suppose I'm talking about contemporary visual art here, be related to horror. But just, I feel very freed by your answer there, Anna, because actually there are all of these other things which art can do, which is to be creepy or to be uncanny or to fulfill some of these different like emotive functions of horror that you were speaking about, even if it's not necessarily the kind of technology of the jump scare that takes you out of yourself, which maybe you can only really get when you are watching a film and you're kind of committed to the true fantasy, whereas art, I suppose, sits in maybe this more kind of ironic or rarefied space and isn't necessarily scary, but you've kind of answered my subtextual question, which was what's art's relationship to horror, and can art be scary? And actually, maybe it can if we expand our idea of the function of horror to include some of to include being a kind of like you say, like a deep emotional catalyst.
Mm.
Mm.
I find it really, you immediately made me think of a piece of art that I found genuinely terrifying and unsettling. I can't remember, it was a video installation to do with clowns being tortured at the Art Institute of Chicago. I cannot tell you the name of the artist because I had to leave almost immediately after I went into the room. It was truly horrific. But I find it really interesting because also it kind of, I think it goes hand in hand with what we were talking about earlier, because cinema is different because cinema has the visual and the audio medium. And I don't know about you, but I found sound really can get under my skin, sometimes a lot more even than images. So for instance, even the piece that I was referencing at the that I saw in Chicago was the thing that made it most unsettling was the way that it sounded in the room as this really overwhelming sound of cackling and clowns that in combination with the images became just too much, but it was actually the constant, never ending and increasingly loud sound of the piece that really, really triggered me. And I think that different people react to things in a different way. Some people will be much more in tune with the imagery, others with the sound. But with art, I think there's another element, which is how is it presented? Can a gallery be presented in a way where it facilitates fear or anxiety or horror? Whether it's, I think the instinctual image that we can come up with when we think of an art space is blank white walls with art displayed in there, or a more stately hallowed museum. And I think there's a lot to think about how that is presented in order to create fear or elicit that more physical and a deeper emotional response to a piece of visual art.
If it's fear that you want, I think I still love the idea that it's actually emotion. And that, I mean, maybe people are scared about showing emotion and then that's enough, but it's like, it's actually about anticipation of being kind of faced with something that was really going to make them feel something.
Mm.
Um, because I also feel, I remember like there was a great moment when I was at uni and I'd made these kind of disembodied legs. And this caused a bit, and I wanted to put them out, I'd made them out of concrete, I wanted to put them outside. It caused a bit of a furore. There was like amongst just, tutors and staff members, we don't know, it's their disembodied legs, but there'll be people in the courtyard that, and like, is it okay to face them with this horror imagery? And it was a bit like, oh my God, it's like 2017. Can we just, they're only out there a week, just put them out there, please. So we put them out, and actually everyone just sat around them and ate their lunch. And it was like the most kind of people just like leaning on them and like eating lunch. And that was like the best response ever. Actually, this thing, it was more of this anticipation of like, and it's like, why are you othering this thing? You're relating it to, oh my God, female body parts that are disembodied and therefore they're representative of this and this and this. And then actually like public reactions to that were completely different. But I think it is this sort of fear of generating emotion is almost more so than the fear that the actual object I don't think necessarily try to scare anybody, I think, through the work that I make, but I do try to make them feel something.
This feels actually like the perfect moment for the question that I wanted to ask the both of you is, how much does the public or the general perception of horror, I guess, affect or inspire your practice?
You want to
Do you
go
want to
first?
take it, Jocelyn? And then I'll come in a sec.
Oh yeah, 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 I can. So you know what? I had an interesting reaction to this question, Anna, which I think which I was like want to kind of delve into. When I first read it, I was like, I don't care at all. And why would I care about
Yeah,
public
I mean, me too, me too.
reaction? Which is also I realized was like my teenage goth, like defensive self coming out in like full force. Because actually I'm an artist and I'm almost completely reliant on public perception to even have a career. So I need to kind of put my teenage goth self to one side. But therefore, I think I've got like a two answers or a two-part answer, I guess. Like, firstly, I think public or general perceptions of horror while I was growing up, because people did kind of abject it, there was a fear around even being associated with it or anything that was associated with it. It was seen as like subversive, like you know, as a teenager, if you were into it, you were going down a bad path or whatever. And that attracted me. I didn't relate to things in mainstream media or a lot of things in mainstream media. And so it kind of felt a little bit like, well, if that, you know, what if what I want is down there then? You know, so it was like it made me, I think, public perceptions and things about horror when I was growing up made me look more into it, like look more into that subculture. And once you're in there, I feel like it is the genre that keeps on giving. So once I was in there, it informed my music taste, my TV, like what I was watching on TV, what I was watching on film, my art, like what I was drawing, what I was making, what I was reading, or pretty much what I was going to go and see, pretty much everything. So then that kind of that's informed my practice as an adult by laying that foundation. I think as an adult, like trying to make a career out of essentially being reliant on that public perception, I now like playing with the perception. So people's unease they've got around it, but also intrigue. Um, so I always quite like to be on that boundary where you don't really know if the sculpture is kind of benign or malign or what the intention is. Is it the victim? Is it the monster? Is it a little bit of both? Um, and I think therefore playing with that perception has been like really useful in my work, actually, kind of playing with people's idea of that, and their intrigue around it. So this kind of it sort of lures them in or hooks them in. So I think that's my sort of two-parter. But yeah, I sort of feel a little bit like supernatural fiction does sort of hold up this warped mirror to society, really. And you get to be, I always think it's like a bit like holding up a mirror to Medusa. You actually get to be more honest through it. And people are kind of lured in by the warped nature of it, feeling like they are in a fiction. They're not having to deal with these issues head on. And I think you can actually open up discussion to a much more honest territory when it's through that lens. But yeah, that's my bit.
I think I'm probably coming at this from like a slightly different angle in that I think I am having a bit of a personal or an artistic struggle at the moment with the fact that ideas of kind of the unruly body have become art within a contemporary art context are really over spoken about. I think we've actually really swung the other way now. Um, Again, I think this is because of a historical marginalizing of lots of feminist performance work from the 60s and 70s and onwards that was very abject, and also a lot of marginalizing of kind of contemporary artwork that dealt with like the AIDS crisis and kind of horrific representations of queerness has been really marginalized for a long time, and there's been a writing of that marginalization now, and a lot of those practices have become much more kind of people are much more aware of them in the mainstream. What I suppose that means for me is that because I am naturally contrarian, like slightly, especially in my relationship to horror, still in a bit of a teenage space, it makes me consider whether or not the kind of bodies that I'm interested in my artwork, these kind of malleable or sort of maladaptive fictional bodies are good vehicles for having the kind of conversations that I want to have. Because I think within my work, I'm much more interested not necessarily in the representation of an underrepresented body, but in the metaphors that these bodies can carry for how we might exist, specifically in kind of contemporary capitalist culture. But I think lots of the conversation around, or lots of the perception of the abject in a contemporary visual art context, it's, I think it's unfortunately the kind of perception of the abject and of unruly bodies, I think also attaches itself to a type of feminism that I'm not very interested in, which is to do with a kind of essential femaleness. Um, and and a lot of reclaiming of kind of unruly feminine bodies in film, but also in contemporary art, has been co-opted by a group of people that I'm not very well, I actively do not want to be associated with. So to speak a bit less cryptically, I think potentially there's something that ends up being a little bit turfy about some conversations about unruly bodies. And so the perception of the grotesque body as connected to a radical feminism that denies other like types of femininity is where my concern around the perception of horror lies, because I think there's been a big kind of shift there. So that's the yeah, maybe mine's a bit more of a niche answer, so apologies for that. But yeah, the grotesque body I think has been talked about a lot and is being a bit co-opted by a set of people that I don't really want to be associated with. But I can't stop making the kind of artwork that I make because it's what I'm interested in. So I'm left in a slightly difficult political position there, I feel.
I think it's really interesting how even the definition of what is grotesque or not is constantly shifting. Yeah. I'm going quiet because I'm thinking about what you were just saying, Matilda.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Yeah, the thinking about kind of the co-opting of it by different groups. Because the bizarre, I don't know, I remember like gr when you grow up with horror, you, it does attract kind of everybody. There are like, you do find yourself in those situations where you're like, my God, we like the same film, but whoa, not for the same reason. you know,
Yeah.
you are sort of forced to have those quite difficult conversations
Mm.
with people who don't have the same views as you at all. I mean, and to sort of quite an extreme, I was a big metalhead when I was a kid, and you went to some like black metal gigs, and everybody was there. Um, but I think there is an interesting posi position that horror can play in that you then can have those difficult conversations with people. Like you have a shared interest, and therefore you kind of outside of this echo chamber. I don't know, like maybe that it does become a vehicle for having difficult conversations. I think it's always played that role, and that's what's always been really interesting. I think certainly like growing up, even just because horror was abjected by a lot of people, you couldn't sort of, you felt like you kind of maybe around the dinner table with your family or with kind of a group of friends who were friends of friends or whatever, who were like, or like preppy or something. And like any mention of horror was like, oh my God, no, totally abject, totally abject. But then you go to a horror gig, like to a metal gig or like a horror conference or something, and you're sat next to somebody who technically has like far stranger, like views far beyond your own, but you are having an argument with them. And you can have those conversations.
And I suppose that's because I think a lot of, the material in horror is extreme and violent. And so the perception of what that might be in aid of, and whether looking at violence can be in aid of anything other than like a kind of titillation or fear, I think becomes a kind of complicated and interesting question. I obviously think it can be an aid of having these difficult conversations, but I certainly think that's not necessarily why everyone is drawn to the kind of extreme material that exists within horror. And so, yeah, you can end up with some uncomfortable bedfellows.
Mm. So I think, oh, who's on the next one? Should we get on to the oh, the next one's yours, Matilda.
Yeah, do we want to take a do we want to take a moment? I mean, happy to ask the next one and for us to keep chatting, but maybe if there's like a bit of a pause, it's a good time to see if anyone else wants to chime in.
Oh, have we got questions in the chat?
I
We
don't at the moment, but
Yeah, we don't have any questions, but yeah, if anybody out there, I can't see you all, so I don't really know who's there, but if anybody wants to kind of yeah, chime in if you've got a question or just a thought really, or anything that expands on that, yeah, do say, or yeah, pop something in the chat. But yeah, maybe we'll carry on chatting if there's no immediate questions. Yeah, I feel like I don't have any questions either because my mind is absolutely reeling, like jumping from bit to bit. And just as I think I formed a question, somebody does something else, and I'm like, oh, no, that's like I'm in a different space now. So yeah, I'm really just enjoying listening to you guys talk. I'm sure everybody else is too. So please carry on.
I mean,
okay,
kind of
well,
the next question feels quite almost like a lead on or could in a strange way. Yeah.
yeah, so I suppose when the three of us were speaking beforehand, and a bit of a bugbear of mine at the moment, based on watching The Substance, which I don't know if many people have seen, but I'll just name and shame the film that is the kind of seed for this question. So I watched The Substance, which I actually kind of quite thoroughly enjoyed. It's a body horror film about aging. Um, but it really struck me that in this film, the kind of what I would have considered the subtext of the horror, which is the idea of kind of aging and how we look at women's bodies as they age out of being sexually desirable, was actually the text of the film. So, Anna, when you were talking about Nightmare on Elm Street, I'm also really here for that. I watched Nightmare on Elm Street at a very young age as well and was very terrified of Freddy Krueger. But and you'll be able to correct me if I'm wrong on this, but is it Nightmare on Elm Street 2 or 3 where the actor it was supposed to be well, there was some very kind of homoerotic like
That's two.
undertones. That's 2, that's what I thought. Um, so yeah, in Nightmare on Elm Street 2, there are some very kind of homoerotic undertones, which became a real problem for the main actor involved. But in that instance, in a kind of older horror film, the text of that film is being scared and Freddy Krueger, and the subtext of it is a kind of meaning or potential meaning or message around queerness. Whereas
Mm.
if we kind of cycle forward 25, more than 25 years, we have the text of the film in the substance being about aging. And for me, I think the subtext is actually the kind of body horror and the monstrosity in that film. So I was just interested in hearing a bit from you guys about what you think about the fact that maybe now, though we've talked a lot about the kind of technology of fear within horror films, actually now maybe horror films are more interested in message and using horror as a vehicle to explore message, whereas before they were maybe interested in horror and the message came out of the horror. So it's been on my mind a lot recently. So I'm interested to hear what you both think about this kind of flip of text and subtext, mainly in kind of mainstream horror film, but also I think in artwork that has that includes kind of horror aesthetics.
Anna, do
I
you want
think there's oh sorry.
Yeah, I
Okay.
was like, this is primed. This is primed for you.
I think it's really interesting and it's both fascinating and kind of frustrating because I think horror has the most possibilities for subtext and metaphor. I mean, the monster is a metaphor for so many different things and is such a product of its own time. I think I think that struggles with the same thing that literary fiction sometimes struggle, which is literary fiction is allergic to plot, as though it somehow undermines its literary values. And I think that sometimes horror thinks that it can um elevate itself into respectability by using the message that it's trying to explore as the text and signposting it over and over again so that everyone who is in the position to elevate it into mainstream or critical success absolutely gets it, which I think has more to do with a wider conversation about how we watch films, about our media literacy levels, about how we interpret characters, about how not every film needs to have a deep message that it's trying to sell. Sometimes a good character is enough, and plot is also a good thing. And they can be as exciting and profound of an experience to watch as something that is designed with a metaphor that is trying to clobber you over the head with over and over again. I I don't have a clear answer for it. It's something I've observed as well, and that I find kind of frustrating and uninteresting. There's quite a few th horror films that come to mind that I don't really want to name and shame, but that carry really their intention so heavily on the sleeve that they're neither scary nor profound. They're just very dogmatic and they come off as really one note. And I think it's partly dictated by the industry. A film goes through so many different hands. It is never just the expression of one person, no matter how how many roles that person can exert. There's always executives involved, there's always financiers involved, there's insurance involved. None of these are, sexy words to bring into this conversation. But I think the fact that film has to go through so many different approval processes, and then once it is presented to an audience, the way that it is packaged and presented then also influences the way that we watch it. So if you're being told up front that this is a film about aging and how women age, you're already going into it with that mentality as opposed to allowing the audience to be surprised and to come to their own conclusions. I always think of when the substance was out and the conversation around it started gaining heat, the film that I was thinking a lot about was Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. And I'm a big fan of the exploitation films of the 1970s, 1960s and 1970s, and how those devolved eventually. But that is a film with characters and a plot and a hell of a lot of subtext that is very similar to the substance, both in its structure and its intentions. But its primary function was always to entertain and to make money, as every film made within the Hollywood industrial machine is. It's there to get a profit. And in that particular case, which is fascinating on its own, it was also a vehicle to give Betty Davis and Joan Crawford leading roles and propel them back into the limelight since they had aged out of Hollywood, despite being instrumental in creating it in the first place. But that's neither here nor there. And I don't know why. This is something I've been thinking about a lot. I think the industrial element is one part. I think our decreasing media literacy is another element. But also I wonder if there's a thing of we're just not allowing images to speak for themselves, and we're kind of there was a really sweet spot from 2014 to about 2 years ago, where horror was very elliptical, where it was very subtextual, where it was very thematic, where it was very driven by images and production design and atmosphere and character. Um, and then we've sort of taken the wrong lessons from that and tried to make the theme so overt that wider, more mainstream audiences would totally get it so that it could make more money, so it's more accessible. Um, and I wonder if that is just the natural progression and cycle that horror goes through every 30 years or so, where something new arises, it catches fire, catches onto the public imagination, it's communicating with audiences in a really profound way, and then we come in and we try to milk it too much, and then eventually kind of ruin the fun of it by trying to make it too clear, and then we'll get into another groove and another wave of what horror can do in the next couple of years, and it will be the same roller coaster all over again.
You know what's so interesting is like I came at it from an art point of view, that question, and it's
Mm,
pretty much identical, like what I'm going to say.
100%.
Yeah. So I feel like I get like the same thing, visual artist. It's like it is almost this kind of over process because you're having to essentially like give a whole reasoning behind the artwork before you make it in order to kind of get the funding behind it or the support or the partners or what have you to like bring it into being. And I think because of the price, like cost of living and price of materials and things, it's so much harder to just go full DIY. You know, people are just like, oh, just DIY, just get a space. And you're like, oh, so, but you've still got to buy all the materials. Now they want rent for spaces. It's hard to get spaces for free. Like, you still got to transport it there. Like, you know, it can cost you £1,000 doing it DIY. So I
Mm.
think we're suddenly losing this hotspot of it, like experimentation and trying things out. And I think, you know, some of my favorite like works or things that have really kind of stuck with me have been, yeah, and I include films in that as well. Like, I mean, Ganja and Hess is a prime example, I feel like, for me in that, right? So it's like he was kind of given this money, but then left alone. So then like made this kind of experimental sort of, I would say it was a bit of an artwork really, and then MoMA also collected it and I had the one remaining copy. Um, so like, you know, had this experimental journey and the subtext, it's not really clear, but what is clear is it was an incredible snapshot of what it was to be a Black filmmaker at that time. And then it had a terrible reception and was like basically buried in the US. So I think, but then has, you know, has thankfully there was a copy that survived and thankfully it could be brought back up. And now it's, you know, it's influencing like filmmakers and artists and you know, sadly, obviously Bill Gunn's died, but um after his death, and you think, God, without that, you know, without that moment of experimentation, that wouldn't have existed. You know, if he'd had to make the kind of quite generic sounding vampire film that he was initially commissioned to make, we wouldn't have Gandra and Hess. And I think you know, and there's loads of kind of there's other artwork. I mean, I'm a big fan of like Kembra Fowler, and I think again the subtext of Kembra Fowler's like work is quite often quite muddy. Essentially because she's not necessarily having to set her intentions, and it is muddy. And I think, you know, sometimes you come away like where it feels quite problematic, or things from the past that felt quite problematic, like her like sewing circle is a great example. She's basically had her vagina sewed shut on film. Like it was she she explained it as a sort of a feminist um stand, using, you know, sewing circle, using kind of domestic materials, but it was shot by a kind of erotic filmmaker, so it didn't sit very comfortably necessarily in that feminist. And you know, a filmmaker obviously then went on to make films for Marilyn Manson, so didn't sit very comfortably in that either. But in that is what makes it really exciting. I think another point I put in here, and everybody bear with me because this might come across as just gross, but I feel like quite often making artwork for me feels like being sick. And I think a lot of my favorite horrors also feel like they're like vomit, because it's basically all the things that you can't digest. Like it's all the things that like I don't sit well with me. I don't have the answers to that. I don't, that's haunting me. I don't get that. And those are the things that come up in the artwork. It's like, and that's, you know, I always talk about kind of art making is quite cyclical. Some things come and go, but other things keep coming around. And those things that keep coming around are quite often the bigger things that you can't digest, things that just you don't understand that aren't right. And I feel like that's what you can't really narrow down in a proposal. You know, that no one would commission that. Hey, I just want to be sick in a gallery. Um, so yeah,
Um,
but it is really intriguing that we have this basically the same across the board.
yeah, I had completely the same response when Anna was speaking, actually. I was like, this could be somebody speaking about the kind of state of contemporary art funding as well. But I think for me, the kind of frustrating thing about maybe this flip between kind of text and subtext is that it gets in the way of what Anna so well described earlier as the kind of commitment you have to have to the thing you're seeing, whether that's a piece of artwork or whether that's a film. I think when you're told what something is about in a very succinct and kind of immediately capturable way, you don't allow the material, whether that's sculptural material or filmic material or painterly material, to kind of let you in on this. And so it forecloses this like sense of curiosity and exploration, which is the really exciting thing about being an audience member whether we're talking about horror or not. But I think especially when dealing with things that might be kind of shocking or surprising, that kind of demand of vulnerability gets a bit shut down when text is really immediately legible.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that.
And
Yeah.
agree. And also, I think it's like quite it really antagonizes an audience because essentially the subtext of that is that if you don't see this piece of art in the way that I'm telling you should see it, you're wrong.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that is absolutely that puts people off of engaging with art, puts people off with engaging with horror, in particular, if they just think, well, I don't see it that way, therefore I don't get it, therefore I'm in the wrong. I just think that's completely you're turning people off from engaging with a whole genre if you have that approach.
Mm,
I
I
was
agree.
I was just going to chip in there because it made me think, Jocelyn, about when we were talking about your commission at Gothic at the moment and its response to Jane Austen, and we very much wanted, you very much wanted, I agreed that your commission and the work that's in the main gallery should hold space for people who feel like critical of Austen, who have differing opinions, who haven't made their mind up yet. Like that's very much what that commission is there for. Like we made an exhibition that's about her traveling writing desk and celebrates her writing and her life. And then actually, we didn't want to do that with the commission. And I don't think that art should do that. It shouldn't just,
Mm,
tell us one narrative. It should be holding lots of narratives and holding space for people to be critical and have these divergent thoughts. So yeah, I think it's kind of comes right back around to lots of conversations we were having.
I had like one of the most incredible moments where I was really worried because I was like, I don't think I like Jane Austen. I think I've gone off Jane Austen. Hopefully it doesn't mind me sharing this, but um, and I was like really worrying about it. And I was going like up and down to Southampton and I was talking to these academic people giving me their time. And I'm like, oh my God, it's getting worse. I can't like and I went to Mia and I was like, I'm worried. I think I don't like Jane Austen anymore. And I was really worried about it. I was like, you know what? I've been like commissioned to make this artwork. With like it's sort of is it a celebration like in of a traveling writing desk? And then it was a real turning point because both you like straight up said that's fine, go with it. You like you get you're an Austen fan, you love a bit of Austen, so you gave her some you didn't go down like quietly, but yeah, you were like, no, but that's not what this exhibition is actually for. And that was a real freedom for me. And then I went um into a talk with Gillian Dow, who's an academic um on Jane Austen. And I was really worried. I was like, oh, she's going to be trying to push me again. And I said straight up, I was like, just so you know, I'm having my doubts about whether I like Jane Austen. And her eyes lit up. She was like, oh my God, you're my favorite kind. She was like, right, we're going to talk about like, and she gave me all about like the nitty gritty, both sides of the argument. And that was great for me. It was like, God, I learned so much more than if I'd said, oh, this is going to be an ode to Austen, and her writing. I don't know. I think, yeah, there is that, like, just having that freedom to be kind of, your mind's not set. And I think, slightly going back, like, more onto the question, but with subtext, also like the things that haunt you. And I think this is maybe what I'd felt with making this commission as well. Like the things that haunt you are the things that you can't that don't sit right. But if someone's telling you, oh, that's that's what it is though, it's set, this is the moral, this is the storyline, this is what you need to read into it, then you go away and you forget the film really. It's like it doesn't play a role. You've been told, it's resolved. Whereas I think the things that haunt me, the things that aren't resolved, I don't really know what to feel about them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. I was just going to say we're at 7:45. We're going to wrap up before 8, but there's somebody's posted in the chat. Leanne, I'm happy to read this out and contribute to the conversation, but I wondered if you wanted to unmute and ask the question yourself, or totally fine if not.
I'm happy for you to read it out.
Cool, great. So yeah, Leanne says, I think all horror films show us some kind of social commentary, for example, in the way that women are objectified and the roles of women in society, but also the representation in horror of what society is shocked by shows how society has changed. For example, the torture porn styles of films like Saw and Hostel, which have none of the themes of kind of romance and hope of older horrors such as Dracula, but instead reflect current social pitfalls. For example, the advent of social media, where children in our society now are often seeing these horrific kinds of images online or in video games at a young age, and are hence more immune to horrific/grotesque horror than in previous generations. It seems that horror film producers have to really push the boundaries to shock audiences now, like in the film The Substance.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah.
I would just say that horror has always had that reaction. Every single generation has thought that that particular era of horror has been the most distressing and shocking and taboo pushing. And I think it's also important to put films into context and in the context of images on a wider scale, not just the images of horror films or the images of films in general. So you mentioned in your comment video games and social media, the torture porn era of horror films, which came out in the, mid 2000s, 2004 is 2002 is used as a good starting point with the first Saw film, and then with the sequels in the franchise with Hostel, which I believe is 2003 or 4. If you think about it, those were the immediate if after effects of the 9/11 images, and it was the images of torture and of Abu Ghraib and of Guantanamo. So those are images that were constantly circulating in the news, not in films, they were on TV. So these were images that we were internalizing, the filmmakers and artists were internalizing, and then itself, they manifested themselves in the wave of horror films that were being produced by, not exclusively, but all those films are American made. Although obviously the filmmakers of Saw were both of them Australian, both the writer and director. Um, so I think it's interesting to put it into the context in the same way in the 1950s, the new Hammer adaptations of the classic literary monsters like Dracula and Frankenstein were considered explicit and bloody and terrifying and titillating and weird and shocking, because they were able to show blood, red blood, instead of the implication of blood like the black and white original Universal monsters are showing. So I think every single wave of horror has had the same kind of approach, or the same kind of criticism lobbied at it. But I think it's a lot more interesting to think about where do those horror images sit alongside our wider relationship with images as a whole, because we now have more screens. Even as we're doing this panel, I have my laptop, I have my phone by my side, I have my TV, there's an iPad over there. Each one of these are screens, and each one of them generate images constantly. There's social media, there's the news, there's now AI generated imagery, there's imagery in magazines, in newspapers, in art exhibitions, everywhere around us. And our levels for tolerance constantly ebb and flow because we're exposed and get used to really quickly to different kinds of imagery and also to absorbing visual information much quicker. So I think, I'm not personally a gamer, but I always take offense on behalf of my gamer friends when I think there's this idea that, oh, well, video games make people more inured to violent imagery or whatever. But at the same time, video games require so much quick processing of visual cues and information, which is why I always get killed very quickly in a video game. And I think there's, that goes hand in hand with social media. The speed at which we're scrolling through TikTok or Instagram and absorbing and analyzing those images, we've never had before. Sure, has it affected our attention span? Future academics will tell us. But I think there, with horror in particular, it's not that you have to push visual boundaries in order to get something out there or commissioned. I think the substance and Coralie Farjan and her way into expressing herself and using horror imagery to create the stories and the films that she wants to create is her own. Her previous film, Revenge, was also quite brutal and very, very violent, but it was using the language of a different kind of subgenre of horror, which is rape revenge films, which have their own visual motifs, their tropes, their kind of narrative conventions as well. I think it's a lot more, yeah, just to say, I think it's a recurring kind of criticism I think that is lobbied against horror, but I think it's never as bad as other images that are surrounding us, I would say.
Yeah, I think, yeah, to chip in a little bit on that, I've maybe have a bit more of a hopeful view of horror and that kind of imagery in that you have control over, and I think sometimes it is a desperation for the creator to like get back a sort of control. A lot of like obviously early like Gothic literature, Jane Austen included with Northanger Abbey, was like concerned with these issues of women being abducted and not having any rights. And but they were constantly sort of writing novels that are quite the Gothic novels that are quite sort of titillating, and people were sort of getting excited by them, but essentially the inspiration behind them was these horrendous things happening to women. um but I think I don't want to berate them for that, because in a way they're taking control. Suddenly they're not in control of what happens in the real world. You're not in control of what the news is showing you, these horrendous images of what's happening to other people, and you can't control that, but you can control what you create. So I think I've always maybe had that love of horror for that, but actually it's a very emotional genre, and I think a lot of the makers of it are sort of trying to at least have this narrative where there you can switch it off. I mean, at least you can switch it off, you know?
Great. I mean, that feels like a bit of a natural conclusion. At least you can switch it off is what we've realised. Yeah, thank you so much, Matilda, Jocelyn, Anna. It's been super interesting. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Um, as I mentioned kind of at the beginning, a recording of this is gonna go up on our YouTube channel, and so people can come back to it, access it, send it to all of your friends and horror fans that you know. Yeah, I'm certainly going to send it around to some people because I think what I found really interesting was moving between thinking about art and thinking about film, and that's not something actually in the visual arts we get to do all that often, is kind of indulge in talking about film and our favorite films and things. So I really loved that. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's been really great talking with you both. And yeah, thanks again to A Space for hosting us and letting us indulge our horror fangirl status.
Yeah, it was
Yeah,
brilliant.
thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to dig into this with the both of you.
Great, cool. Well, yeah, I'll see you all soon. Thank you for coming.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much. Thanks to everyone for being here.